Okay, so welcome everyone. Our speaker, Honorable Sudhir Kakkar sir, coordinator of this webinar, Minati ma'am, Professor R.C. Tripathi sir, who will be joining us soon, and all the participants joining us here on Zoom platform, as well as those who are watching this live streaming on Facebook. I welcome you all in this webinar on the behalf of the entire psychological community of the nation, on the behalf of National Academy of Psychology, and on my own personal behalf. It's a pride privilege to have you all here. Before I introduce the coordinator of this workshop, I would like to brief you about NAOP initiative on this webinar series. You all might be aware that NAOP is one among the few recognized psychological body in India. It was conceptualized in the year 1985 and 87 in Bhopal meetings of then young and senior psychologists. It was formerly decided in 1989 to build up this psychological community and make better use of the psychological resources that was available at that time. And in 1990, it was formerly, it came on board in IIT Kanpur. Since then, NAOP is progressing well, and now we can proudly say that NAOP has contributed a lot in the development of psychology in India, both in terms of capacity building and nurturing research and publications. NAOP has its flagship publication, Psychological Studies, which have gained reputation in the recent past under the leadership of Professor Girishwar Mishra sir. Then the legacy was carried forward by Professor Damodar Sur, and now it is under the leadership of Professor Purnima Singh. It is being published by Springer, which tells a lot about its credibility. Now also holds its annual convents in which we try our best to give platform to both the established psychologists as well as budding psychologists of the nation to come forward, interact, and share their researches. We also hold workshops and other events to cater to the demands of the community. And this now webinar series is a new activity that is being done by NAOP in this pandemic era, when everyone is confined to their homes and there are not much to disseminate and understand and learn. So NAOP decided to host this webinar series. I would also like to clarify, especially to participants, that these webinar series by NAOP are highly valuable in nature and is only done to disseminate knowledge, increase awareness, and with the mission, NAOP's mission, to bring you the best of the field. As of now, we have decided not to make it a certificate-based webinar because we really don't want to engage in the rat race of certificate collection and building. This is third webinar in the series. We had our first webinar on childhood issues coordinated by Professor Bhumika Kar. The second webinar on psychosocial impacts on the pandemic, in which we had the former president of International Union of Psychological Sciences, Professor Seth Cooper, and Professor Nandita Chaudhary under the coordinatorship of Professor Janak Pandey sir. And this is the third webinar in the series, in which we have again brought Sudhir Kakkar sir. I am sure there is no need to introduce, but I will request Minati ma'am to introduce him. But first, let me have the privilege to introduce the coordinator of this workshop, is this webinar, Minati ma'am. She is also the president-elect of NAOP. She will be joining the office soon, but she has started her mission to bring NAOP on further path of glory, and this webinar is one of the initial steps. Professor Minati Panda is Professor of Cultural Psychology and Educational and Formal Cultural Psychology and Education, and is a former chairperson and the coordinator of the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, School of Social Science, JNU. She is also the director of the National Multilingual Education Resource Consortium, JNU. She has published 3 books titled Multilingual Education for Social Justice. Another is on globalizing the locale. This was by Orient Black Swan. The second book was on epistemic practices in Sorona mathematics, NMRC and VBLP, and social justice through multilingual education. It was published by Multilingual Matters UK. 3 books are in pipeline, and we hope that we will be able to read this soon. It is being published by Orient Black Swan, Routledge and Springer respectively. She has published several papers in the area of critical pedagogy, language education, cultural psychology, culture, mathematical cognition, creativity, and child rights. She has been very active in the field of social justice also. She was advisor to the government of Sri Lanka for trilingual policy and Ministry of Tribal Affairs, Government of India for multilingual education. She has received several prestigious research grants. Some of these funders were Bonlier Foundation, Netherlands, Economic and Social Research Council, UK, UGC and NCRT, India, DART, Germany, and UNICEF, India. She was a visiting faculty at several universities in the US and Europe, and her most recent visit was in Columbia University, New York, where she worked till June 2020. And with this brief introduction to ma'am, I invite you, ma'am, and I would request you to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sudhir Kakkar, sir. Ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Tushar. I think it's a tall order to introduce Professor Sudhir Kakkar. He, at one level, he doesn't need an introduction. And I was introduced to his work in MA and MPhil through his books, Intimate Relations, the Conflict and Choice, Culture and Psyche, the Indian Psyche, and then subsequently a few more. Professor Kakkar had a very interesting journey in the early career of him. He started as an engineer, switched on to business economics, did his PhD in economics, and then he joined the Sigmund Freud Institute in Frankfurt in 1971, and that's where you probably met Erik Erikson. And they started a new journey, and which we all witnessed through his books. I would like to use the term queer here because it's dealing with psychoanalytic concepts is very queer, and especially when it deals with psychoanalytically oriented biographies, and also his own biography, which was one of the bestseller, the Book of Memory. I thought he was extremely honest and also demystifies a lot of psychoanalytic concepts and make them home to everybody. He has around 6 fictional works, very well-known books. Some of them I can read the names. I mean, The Aesthetic of Desire, Indian Love Stories, Ecstasy, Meera and the Mahatma, The Crimson Throne, The Devil Take Law. And he has more than 20 non-fiction books. Some of the names I mentioned, and you can also see in his website as well as in the Wikipedia page the names of the books, and almost all the books are extensively read by Indian scholars as well as outsiders. And he's considered to be one of the 25 uh, uh, top thinkers of 21st century by one of the magazine in Germany, and also he featured in the New York Times as a leading scholar of 21st century. Uh, less I say, better it is, because Professor Kakkar doesn't need more introduction. I mean, doesn't need any introduction, in fact. And his name in my discipline, and also is has excelled in crossing the boundaries of disciplines and creating discomfort with the settled concepts. And I also like the way he unsettles a lot of psychological concepts, and digs into the unconscious in a manner that the readers always wait for the next page and the next book, and that makes him an extremely successful scholar. I also know of another side of him which I like, partly because my husband is also uh, a poet, and his love for poetry is something that makes him also uniquely, that positions him him uniquely in the academic discourse. Uh, Before I pass on to Professor Kakkar, let me just tell you give you a little background to this particular talk. I approached Professor Kakkar and two other scholars a month back. Professor Kakkar quickly responded. In fact, all three of them responded and responded positively. Professor Kakkar wanted to speak on this particular theme, and I can't tell you how happy I was, because I always thought that the psychologists are a little intimidated to deal with issues upfront. And we had the Delhi riot, and we still didn't discuss elaborately what happened and what caused that riot. And, you know, uh, we didn't engage with this riot to also understand the dynamics and the outcomes of this riot, and what are the kind of psychological upheaval it actually resulted in. So I was really happy when Professor Kakkar agreed to speak on this, in fact volunteered to speak on this particular theme. His book, he wrote a book which actually eminently positions him to speak on this theme. He wrote The Colors of Violence in 1995. And I had read this book long back. And after he offered to speak on this theme, I read the book cursorily. I didn't read every page, but I read the book again. And I realized that, his take on primordial, uh, getting a precedence over instrumental in explaining the severity of a violence, especially religious violence, is a very, very significant theme. Although I just want to mention this here so that Professor Kakkar also responds to that particular aspect of a religious violence, is that in Delhi, I was in New York when Delhi violence happened. And I was watching it through YouTube, partly because the Indian TVs are too loud and you have to be deaf to listen to them. And I believe only the deaf listen to them. So I had to watch through videos. And what I realized that, the killers were not from the same neighborhood. Maybe the people who stole, they were from the neighborhood. They may be very economically less well, but some of them were from the neighborhood. And they stole because they thought stealing is legitimate, because they were also trying to right a wrong, that is economic inequality. But they didn't have enough religious reasons to do that. Sometimes for some, choosing which shop to steal from or house to steal from was determined by one's religious identity, but otherwise that was never a concern. But the killer was definitely motivated by religion, and the killer was not from that community, that neighborhood, in large number of cases. And the killers were men, they were not women. Many died were also women, many raped were also women, but the killers were not women. So when we talk about the inner psychological resources getting organized in a particular way, and also organized because of this primordial basis, uh, I would like to say that why it work differently for the people in the same neighborhood and the people who came outside. So obviously there is something more that explains the severity of killing and also the willingness of killing. And it could be also, it's the triggers, the instrumental triggers are not one-time triggers, they're obviously long, time triggers, but those triggers work differently for the people who are in the same neighborhood. They still want to save each other, but it worked differently from those who came from outside to kill or to create a conflict. So I think, for it'll also be interesting to see how Professor Kakkar reflectively engages with a book that was written 25 years back in his attempt to talk about a recent event. Um, I think, Professor Kakkar, you are eminently placed to talk about this particular theme. And we are really, really fortunate to have you on board. And I welcome you on behalf of NOW and the audience to this webinar. And please, I pass it on to you. Thank you. So, sir, I will switch off my audio.
Okay.
I'll mute it, isn't it? So, sir?
Yes.
I'll mute it.
Okay. Huh? All right.
I'll switch on when Professor Kakkar finishes his talk.
Okay.
Professor Kakkar.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Panda, for a very kind introduction. You're quite right about this talk. It was initiated in that sense, or started with the Delhi riots. I prepared it at that time, but then of course the pandemic eclipsed everything else. But we know the pandemics will pass, but my fear is that this problem is not going to pass, that this we are going to have more and more and often enough. Okay, to start, well, to begin with a confession, although I do not subscribe to the beliefs and cosmogonies of any of the world's religions, I'm acutely aware of the significance of religious experience for human life, and in our country, for meeting the cultural and spiritual needs for a vast number of our peoples. Leaving aside the mystics, it is the ceremonial forms of religion where most people commonly experience a connection with nature, community, the sacred, experiences from which the individual emerges purified and with a sense of awe and significance. Performances in temples, mosques, churches, gurdwaras, as also in other spaces, may be illusions, yes, but they are necessary and even desirable illusions that light up the narrow, mundane world of daily existence. A world which has always been inadequate to our experience and unequal to bear the burden of our hopes. For a brief period of time, they let us transcend what the Irish poet William Yeats called the desolation of reality. In our focus on rationality and empirical reality, we tend to ignore the demands and longings of the human imagination. Some will call it of the human soul, which religion seeks to address. But my task today is not to elaborate on the uses of religion, but to link religion, or rather an aspect of it, to what is happening in our own society. What I would like to briefly do is to touch upon religious conflict in our country. A religion, we like to believe, is about love, love of God and love of fellow man. Religion, we feel, is essentially about compassion and strives for peace and justice for the oppressed. Indeed, freedom from violence, an enduring wish of mankind, is reflected in various religious versions of heaven. All this is true, yet we all know that violence is present in all religions as a positive and even necessary force for the realization of religious goals. Religious violence has many forms, which have found expression in the practice of animal or human sacrifice, in righteous and often cruel punishment envisaged for sinners, killings of witches or apostates, and an ascetic violence against the self. Every religion, as John Bowker has demonstrated, has a vision of divinely legitimized violence under certain circumstances. In the Semitic religions, we have the holy war of the Christians, the just war of the Jews, and the jihad of the Muslims, where the believers are enjoined to battle and destroy evildoers. In other religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, with their greater reputation for tolerance and non-violence, violence is present in the realm of the sacred as part of the created order. In Hinduism, for instance, there's a cycle of violence and peacefulness as the Kali Yuga is followed by the Golden Age. Buddhist myths talk of 7 days of the sword, where men will look on and kill each other as beasts, after which peace returns and no life is taken. Although Islam, especially in its current phase, and medieval Christianity have had the most violent reputations, fanatics can unleash any violence contained in a religion, even if the religion is really perceived to have a violent potential. Coming to our own country, in the year 1924, writing on the causes of Hindu-Muslim conflict, Mahatma Gandhi observed, "I see no way of achieving anything in this afflicted country without a lasting heart unity between Hindus and Muslims. There is no question more important and more pressing than this. In my opinion, it blocks all progress." Gandhi's observation on the importance of finding a solution to the conflict for India's future integrity and well-being continues to be valid, although he may not have sufficiently appreciated that what appears to be a conflict between India's two largest communities is not about religion. What I mean by this is that the conflict is not about matters of religious belief, dogmas, worship, or adherence to different faiths and gods, but about a deep human need to discharge frustration, hate, and violence that is in fact ignored by religion. Religious practices are rarely targeted during riot situations. People I have talked to during riots who were open to arson and murder still disapproved of actions that would hurt the religious sentiments of another community, such as, for example, the throwing of the carcass of a pig in a mosque or of a cow in a temple. Most knowledgeable commentators have therefore identified factors other than religion as the root cause of an ostensibly religious conflict. Although there is near unanimity on the conflict not being religious, there's a singular lack of agreement on its root cause. I have discussed the root cause identified by social scientists of various persuasions, historians, political economists and political scientists, social psychologists, demographers, In my 1995 book, The Colors of Violence, Religious Ethnic Identities in Conflict, which Professor Panda also mentioned, the book had its empirical base in depth interviews with the victims, men, women, and children, as also the perpetrators of the violence in the Hyderabad riots following the demolition of Babri Masjid. More than 25 years later, it is depressing to note that I don't think I can change any of its conclusions or its assessment of the future of Hindu-Muslim relations. Today, though, I would only like to focus on the psychological, specifically psychoanalytic understanding of the conflict. The other perspectives, for instance, a historical understanding of Hindu-Muslim relations, can be viewed in concert with the psychological understanding. Hindu nationalists, politically represented by the BJP, view the conflict in civilizational terms. They see Hindu-Muslim relations framed by the fundamental divide of a 1,000-year-old conflict between two civilizations in which the Muslims, militarily victorious and politically ascendant for centuries, tried to impose Islam on their Hindu subjects through all means, from coercion to bribery and cajolery, and yet had only limited success. The vast majorities of Hindus kept their civilizational core intact while they resentfully tolerated the Muslim onslaught. The rage of the denigrated Hindu stored up over long periods of time had to explode once historical circumstances sanctioned such eruptions. Other historians of a more liberal bent belonging to the secular school aver that Hindus and Muslims are relatively recent categories in Indian history. In pre-colonial and early colonial times, there was a commingling of Hindus and Muslims, most of them converted Hindus in any case. Incorporating Persian and Turkish elements, there was a flowering of a composite cultural tradition, not only in music, art, and architecture, but also in the development of a syncretic popular religion. The large-scale violence between the two communities, which began to spread in the late 19th century, was chiefly because of colonialism, namely the British policy of deliberately strengthening Muslim identity because of the threat of Indian nationalism in the early 20th century, in which Hindus played a prominent part. Nevertheless, the composite culture shared by Hindus and Muslims is still alive, especially in rural India, and comes under strain because of the need of political parties to polarize Hindu and Muslim identities in quest for electoral gains. In contrast to the historians, most ordinary Indians operate with both versions of history. In times of heightened conflict between the two communities, the Hindu nationalist history that supports the version of age-old animosity between the two assumes preeminence and organizes cultural memory in one particular direction. In times of relative peace, the focus shifts back to the secular history emphasizing commonalities and shared pieces of the past. Many of the cultural memories that were appropriate during the conflict retreat, fade, or take on new meaning, while others that incorporate the peaceful coexistence of Hindus and Muslims resurface. Is this changing? Is one perspective that of a fundamental civilizational clash becoming dominant both in peaceful and conflictual times, with the other one celebrating syncretism in full retreat? The answer to this question is of utmost importance. In societies as in individuals, it is the memory of the past, not in the sense of what really happened, but what we believe happened, that is psychologically significant. It is this memory, however historically distorted or dubious, which influences our attitudes and behavior. It cannot be decoupled from the present and from the future. The future always carries an ancient heart within it. For my own discipline, psychoanalysis, religious and ethnic group identities are deeply anchored in our inner world. At some point of time in early life, like the child's I am, which heralds the birth of his individuality, there's also a complementary we are, which later announces the birth of a sense of community, of family, caste, region, religion. I am differentiates me from other individuals. We are makes me aware of other groups sharing the physical and cognitive space of my community. The further development of VR proceeds on two parallel tracks. One is that of our own community as we commonly idealize it, which lends an individual life a sense of intimacy and connection, enriching emotional life with feelings of attunement and resonance with other members of the community. I would call this the light community. The image of one's light community is first conveyed to the child by one's parents and family. As has been perceptibly remarked, a baby has no history. Soon, the parents will give it theirs. The child's image of her community, religious or ethnic, is formed through the stories that are told from one generation to another. And these stories often come with shared multi-generational rituals and communal gatherings of all ages, anchoring the image of the light community deep in the psyche. The growing child identifies with the emotional investments of her family and loved elders in the community's symbols and traditions, and incorporates these idealizations of the community, which have served them so well, as they will serve the child, in the enhancement of self-esteem for belonging to such an exalted and blessed entity. Parallel to the development of the light community, there's also what I'd call the dark community that takes simultaneous birth in the child's mental life and accompanies the light community throughout life, though less consciously, as its shadow. Because of the child's early difficulties in integrating contradictory representations of the self and parents, the good, loving child and the bad, raging one, the good, caretaking parents and the hateful, frustrating ones, the child disowns the bad representations of his own self and of his parents through projection. First projected to inanimate objects and animals, bad doggy, and later to people and other groups, the latter often available to the child as a pre-selection by his own group, the disavowed bad representations of the self need such reservoirs as the psychoanalyst Vamik Volkan calls them. Hindus and Muslims, Arabs and Jews, Tutsis and Hutus, whites and blacks, and various other antagonistic groups who are in a long-term clinch need each other as enemies. They are each other's necessary reservoirs, repositories for frustration, anger, and hateful feelings for which no clear-cut addressee is available. I must again emphasize that the dark community we carry within ourselves is largely unconscious. The child's knowledge of the dark community is not anthropological or religious textual, but what I would call knowledge feeling that is pre-verbal and, so to speak, has entered the child's very bones. For instance, in very early childhood, an upper caste child in a village does not know about the Dalit community, but has sensed the sudden kinesthetic tension in the body of his mother, father, aunt, uncle, when a Dalit has approached too near. He has registered their expressions of disgust, unconsciously mimicking them in his own face and body at any threatened contact with an untouchable. Since most of the bad representations arise from a social disapproval of the child's animality as expressed in his or her aggressivity, dirtiness, and unruly sexuality, it is preeminently this animality that a good self belonging to a moral light community must disavow and place in the reservoir dark community. We see this happening again and again in modern and historical accounts of conflicts between communities. In 16th century France, for instance, Catholics knew that Protestants were not only dirty and diabolic, but that their Holy Supper was disordered and drunken, a bacchanalia, and that they snuffed out candles and had indiscriminate sexual intercourse after voluptuous psalm singing. Protestants, on their part, knew that Catholic clergy had an organization of hundreds of women at the disposal of priests and canons, who, for most part, were sodomites as well. In contemporary India, whenever there is tension between Hindus and Muslims in any part of the countries, Hindus know that Muslims are not only unclean in their personal habits, but their men are hypersexual, always coveting our women. Muslims, on the other hand, know that Hindus are impure, napak, cunning and cowardly like Gidar, jackals, who lack control over their impulses and behavior. If the shadow side of our individual identity is the danger of an unregenerate pursuit of selfishness and unbridled greed, then the dark side of our group identity is exclusivity, intolerance, and potential for violence. Little wonder that love thy neighbor as thyself needed to be a commandment. The neighbor is potentially an antagonist, basically dangerous, and therefore to be ignored if distant enough, to be demeaned when too visible, and to be attacked when threatening to encroach. While all the possible causes, economic, historical, political, social, psychological, psychoanalytical, are encountered in almost every conflict situation, what is of special interest to me is the psychological process by which religious group identities come to the forefront in times of tension, as seem to be happening now in large parts of the country. The buildup of immediate tension before actual violence occurs is because of a perceived threat to the community's religious group identity. The perceived threat makes members of the community act demonstratively through words and actions as Hindus or as Muslims. In turn, the demonstration of this religious identity threatens members of the other community who too begin to mobilize their identity around their religious affiliation. Thus begins a spiral of perceived or misperceived threats and counter postures, which raises a tension between the two communities. In such times, individuals begin to increasingly think of themselves as Hindus and Muslims and see members of the other community in stereotypes. There follows an inevitable homogenization and depersonalization as individual Hindus or Muslims become interchangeable, perceived in terms of a group category rather than their personal idiosyncratic natures. Conversations couched in categories increase markedly. Look at what the Hindus are doing. The Muslims have crossed all limits. We have already seen the stereotypes, the Hindu and Muslim images of each other that are attributed to the adversarial group and which are orally transmitted through the generations that come increasingly to the fore. The activation of a Hindu-Muslim conflict and a movement of religious identities to the forefront of consciousness still need powerful additional impulses before the outbreak of violence becomes possible. The zone of indifference with regards to one's faith and religious community in which everyday life is lived, unfettered and unworried by excessive and obsessive scrutiny may be breached by momentous external events, but the breach needs considerable widening before violence comes pouring out. It is here that demagogues, owing allegiance to fundamentalist religious political formations, enter the scene. On the one hand, they stoke the group's persecution anxiety with images of a besieged and endangered community on the verge of extinction at the hands of the other enemy group. On the other, they heighten the group's narcissism by singing of its glories while ridiculing the other community. However, once the violence starts, it soon slips out of their controls as rumors stoke the flames of violence into a raging fire. These rumors have remained relatively unchanged in all the riots I have closely studied or been involved with as an observer, going as far back as the partition violence of 1947. The changes, if any, are superficial. Perhaps the cast of villains has been updated. VHP and Bajrang Dal instead of the earlier RSS, Pakistani terrorists instead of Pakistani spies, AK-47s instead of rifles, poisoned milk in pouches being sold instead of in pails. But the structure of the rumors has remained essentially the same. In the rumors common to both Hindus and Muslims, one set of rumors seeks to undermine the individual sense of basic trust acquired in the earliest phase of life, and thus to set free a paranoid potential and persecutory anxiety on which all rumors will further feed. Another set of rumors dealing with the threat of sexual violence further amplifies these persecutory fantasies. Besides this set of rumors subverting individual identity, there's another set of rumors relating to group identity, which magnifies a group's specific and historically derived fear in relation to the enemy group. In Muslims, the fear is of a reabsorption in Hindu society, while in Hindus, it relates to the threat to the freedom of the country and a dreaded revival of medieval Muslim suzerainty. If wished for, I could elaborate on these rumors in our discussion. The last time I studied or looked at these rumors was during the Gujarat violence. We need to be singularly aware of the dangers of religious group identity, or rather its dark twin we in India call communal identity, coming to the forefront of our psyches. A process which seems to have accelerated in the last few years. Each one of us, of course, has many group identities of family, region, profession, language, nation, and so on. The involvement of religion, rather than other social identities, does not dampen, but on the contrary, increases the violence of the conflict. Religion brings to conflict between groups a greater emotional intensity and a deeper motivational thrust than language, region, or other markers of group identity. This is at least true of countries where the salience of religion in collective life is very high, as it is in India. With its historical allusions from sacred rather than profane history, its metaphors and analogies having their source in sacred legends, the religious justification of conflict involves fundamental values and releases some of our most violent passions. Moreover, rhythms of religious ritual, whether in common prayer, processions, or other congregational activities, are particularly conducive to breaking down boundaries between members of a group and thus, in times of tension and threat, forging violent mobs. And as long as the perpetrator of violence maintains his religious commitment, he rarely displays guilt or shame for his murderous actions, something which is not true of the same actions as a member of other kinds of groups. The perpetrators who generally belong to the margins of their community, pejoratively called gundas, anti-socials, etc., are now seen as the community's protectors for the duration of the violence. No longer looked down upon, their heady self-image, reinforced by the community, is that of warriors, soldiers in cause of faith. The conscious experiencing and expression of identity through the religious group, rather than through other group identities, such as those of family, caste, or profession, varies with individuals. At the one extreme, there are always some Hindus and Muslims whose other identities are not overwhelmed by their religious group identity, even in the worst phases of a violent conflict. These are persons who wear their religious group identity lightly and are capable of acts of compassion and self-sacrifice, such as saving members of the enemy group from the fury of a rampaging mob, even at considerable danger to their own physical safety. On the other extreme, there are others, the fanatics, whose behavior, even in times of peace, is dictated by their communal identity, an armor that is rarely taken off. Let me also note that in both communities, the dark side of religious group identities, communal identities as we've called them, tend to be less salient for women than men. And for this reason, you will find the male pronoun dominating in the rest of this talk. Incidents of violence and their aftermath raise afresh the issue of an individual's identification with his religious group and brings it up to the surface of his consciousness. Every time a violent incident that is even remotely connected to religious groups occurs in India or in some other parts of the subcontinent, the reach and spread of modern communications ensure that a large number of people are soon aware of it. This awareness may be fleeting for some, last over a period of time for others, but the process is almost always accompanied by a pre-conscious self-interrogation on the significance of the religious community for one's sense of identity. For varying periods of time, individuals consciously experience their identity through their religious group rather than the other groups we have talked of. The duration of this period, or even whether there will be a permanent change in the mode of identity experience for some, who will henceforth encase themselves in the armor of an aggressive communal identity, depends on many factors. Not the least is the success of political groupings in encouraging such a switch. As for the future, there is more than one scenario for the likely evolution of Hindu-Muslim relations. The Hindu nationalist, who views the conflict as a product of Hindu and Muslim religious cultural traditions, believes the only way of avoiding large-scale violence is a change in the Muslim view of the community's role, traditions, and institutions, so that the Muslim can adapt to the Hindu majority's culture. To ask the Muslims to recognize themselves in the Hindu nationalist version of Indian history, to expect them to feel their culture confirmed in Hindu symbols, rituals, and celebrations, is asking them to renounce their religious cultural identity and to erase their collective memory so that they become indistinguishable from their Hindu neighbors. To be swamped by the surrounding Hindu culture has been the greatest fear of the Indian Muslim, articulated even by medieval Sufis, who are commonly regarded as closer to the Hindu spiritual traditions and as exemplars of the composite syncretic tradition. Such an assimilation is feared precisely because it is so tempting, holding the promise of a freedom from fear of violence and an active and full participation in the majority culture. The Hindu nationalist dilemma is that the Muslim continues to decline and offers the nationalists believe they cannot refuse. The nationalists find that the Muslim is too big to either swallow or spit out. The secularist, who views the conflict as rooted in socio-economic factors, is more sanguine on the future of Hindu-Muslim relations. In the long run, the secularist believes the economic development of India will alter the social structural conditions and thus assign the conflict, as the cliche would have it, to the dust heap of history, as religious identities fade away and play less and less of a role in private and especially in public life. We need to sound a skeptical note on the belief in the primacy of political and economic structures in the shaping of consciousness. Cultural traditions, including the beliefs regarding the demonic other, are transmitted through the family and have a line of development separate from the political and economic systems of a society. What I would like to believe, that is hope, is that we are moving towards an era of recognizing Hindu-Muslim differences rather than only pursuing their commonalities, which too are present. That we are moving towards a multicultural society rather than a composite culture. We may have to give up Gandhi's dream of lasting heart unity and content ourselves with the creation of a common public realm guarded by our constitution, while regarding the other community perhaps with benign indifference in private. After all, how can one feel close, have a heart unity with someone with whom you cannot even eat together? Not to speak of violent emotions aroused in case of intermarriage, which for me is the most significant marker of the heart unity of communities. It is not theology that divides communities, but anthropology. Not ways of believing, but ways of living out the religious identities. The primary work of bringing harmony between antagonistic groups is internal. It must first take place in our minds. This work needs the realization that we all have a dark group within us, that our unconscious needs for enemies is as deeply embedded in us as by the more conscious need for friends. Our shadow side is part of our developmental heritage that can be disavowed only at the peril of it being then available to demagogues who seek to harness it to the goal of divisiveness and differentiation. It is a further realization that our development heritage from our childhoods is not our fate, that we need not act according to our darker dictates. It is a realization that between loving and hating your neighbor, there's a range of choices, ranging from various shades of amity to indifference that are also available to each one of us. It is not easy to give up our prejudices that exist at a deep level of feelings, but we can at least become aware of them and try to prevent them from influencing our thinking. Only such introspection can make me immune against all those who seek to stoke my group's persecution anxiety. To look inwards is to give up the illusory clarity and excitement of thinking in black and white and embrace the color gray, the preeminent color of reality. Gray is not a color of excitement, of passion. Buddha with his Sarvam Dukkham and Freud with his promise of exchanging the sufferer's hysterical misery for common human unhappiness are both depressives, votaries of the color gray, and thus supreme realists, since reality for anyone who looks at it without blinkers is depressing, the desolation of Yeats. As one of the psychoanalytic school avers, we are all born as paranoics, but at best may mature into depressives. Fortunately, gray is not only the color of rational thought, but has allies in our psychic depths, if we would only harness them to our cause. I'm speaking of our natural human compassion, just as natural as the violence in our dark nature. We know from experiments using brain imaging that watching the suffering of someone who appears to be a victim of violence activates a similar pain network in our brains. the so-called mirror neurons, showing sufferings of victims of collective violence, followed by discussions as part of our educational curriculum in schools and colleges, as also in other group settings, is an obvious next step in the long-term combating of violence. It is important that we realize that to successfully address the dark side of our community identity, we need to harness all the resources of art, musical, visual, and cinematic. Only then can we move beyond the mere provision of information that has become such a disproportionate part of our education system, and thus reach the deeper layers of the psyche that are inaccessible to language alone. Again, I'm not advocating a weakening of religious identities that give millions of lives their meaning, but an encouragement of efforts to mitigate their darkness. Concurrently, I would also suggest the fostering of a superordinate identity, Bharatiyata or Hindustaniyat, that can subsume Hindu, Muslim, and all other religious identities by connecting them to a wider identity than those of the religious group. Even if the negotiation of this project is messy and riddled with obstacles. We have seen the success of this strategy in many other kinds of conflicts. The offer of a European identity to dampen the centuries-old conflict between German and French identities. The accent on a Christian identity to significantly reduce the virulence of the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Enemies may always be needed, but at least they are no longer the traditional ones. They are now outside the borders of the space occupied by the old enemy. At the end, even while I'm aware of how difficult it is to resist the siren song of black and white with its soaring notes of love and hate, both in our personal and social political lives, I would urge a sustained exploration of the much less volatile and benign hues of gray. Gray has its own satisfactions of insight that comes from listening to the soft but persistent voice of reason in Freud's formulation, and the fostering of compassion that bridges the divide fueled by passions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kakkar. It has been actually a kind of poetry to us. And I always find you speaking in this language and style, which comes across as a poetry on a very deep and serious academic theme. Thank you very much. We'll now take some questions. And we thought Professor Tripathi is also on board, R.C. Tripathi. Professor R.C. Tripathi, can you hear me? Professor Tripathi? Professor Kakkar, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you well.
Okay. Is Professor R.C. Tripathi on board? I thought we'll start with him because it's broadly his area. He comes from social psychological perspective and he has worked on non-violation. You are aware of his work. So I thought he may interact with you for 5-10 minutes and then we'll open it to others.
Mm-hmm.
If he's not on board, I'll just ask 1 or 2 questions, and then there are many interesting questions posed by our participants. And Tushar has those questions. They have written those questions when they registered. So Tushar will read out the questions and you can respond. Tushar, is Professor Tripathi on board?
He is logged in, but I'm not sure why he is not answering. Maybe I'll give him a call just now. And
okay. So I'll just ask 1 or 2 questions to Professor Sudhir Kakkar meantime, and then if Professor Tripathi doesn't come on board, you please start reading out the questions that you have received from the participants.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So Professor Kakkar, I agree with most of what you said. Is Professor Kakar on board?
I can hear you. I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with most, I mean, almost all that you said. You know, when lynching, you know, we had a series of lynching incidents in the last 3-4 years. Some of us were thinking about, you know, our families. And what we realized that you know, if we look at Indian families very carefully, it's highly gendered. You know, we live gender day in and day out, and that's also most invisibilized. So this, the very act of living an unequal, you know, relationship on a daily basis, and also helping the family to invisibilize the inequality, creates a kind of psychological and also social plane on which these inequalities, the religious and other, you know, structures stand. So what we were thinking that if we question, you know, the fundamentals of these inequalities, say gender inequality, we may also indirectly question and also create, you know, the tensions for religious, you know, it's not inequality, but this hatred, and also always thriving on this narcissistic pleasure of I'm superior. If I'm not superior, then I do everything to feel that I'm superior, you know, and this land belongs to me. So one has to question that, but I think one of the best way to question that is probably to question also this gender hierarchy that we live. That's where I would come to your concept of Oedipus, you know, and in your book, there's The Colors of Violence. You have talked about how Oedipus is a far more dominant, you know, or determinant structure than Electra. And it's rightly so, because it's a patriarchal society, you know. Had it been matriarchal, then maybe the Electra would have been more, you know, important. So it's also important to analyze Oedipus in structural terms. I think Deleuze and Guattari did, you know, critique Freud, but also made Oedipus intellectually more interdisciplinary and also accessible to many. And so they talked about a triangle, Oedipal triangle, and they brought power into that explanation. But I think this Oedipus also needs to be explained in structural terms to reveal the underlying gender inequalities forming our the core of our unconscious as well. So can you, therefore, for the benefit of our readers, I mean listeners, can you talk about Oedipus a bit in structural terms?
Yeah.
I think I'll stop here because we have too many questions from our audience. So let them ask. If we have time, I'll ask more questions.
The question, I think there may be a slight misunderstanding. I question the hegemony of the Oedipus thing in our cultural setting, very much so. Oedipus is very much a Western one in the global North ones. If there is a hegemonic one, it is the Devi, the Mahadevi. That is, if one starts looking at myths, that may be much more hegemonic, and not only in ours, in Japanese also. So the Oedipus is a very ethnocentric psychoanalytic. Not that it is absent, but how dominating it is in the cultural part of it. That is the thing. Absent, of course, it is not, because it is the thing generational. What is the relationship between the generations going to be like? But this will take us much too far away. I don't know how we would kind of link up. You're quite right about the gender inequalities. I mean, nobody would dispute.
I tell you, just give me one minute, because this concept of strong father, a strong leader, this has created a very masculine culture as well as discourse in this country, and that also legitimizes a kind of hierarchy in which the kind of hierarchy that actually sort of supports these violent actions, because these violent actions also need to stand on some kind of what do you say, unjust. But that's again about hierarchy. I want to be better than you. It's never about equality. It's about I'm more legitimate as a citizen, or I decide the symbolic culture of the society. I dictate the terms of symbolic resources in this society. I think the competition is for, again, who controls that symbolic resources, or even mythology, or the whole identity reificatory process. What gets reified in public realm. So I thought we need to question also gender. Comes indirectly to the whole discourse.
Yeah. I can't really relate it. It is really a very different kind of a question, of a very important one, certainly, but relating it to the religious conflict of so many of the identities get subsumed under that when that conflict is taking place. The women they are the ones who start they become members, they feel themselves equal members. Even children, small children who are sitting on the roofs throwing stones, are no longer derided small beings, but very much a part of the force. So this is one of the big attractions of these violent conflict, in the times of conflict of these big identities, because once the differences in the group itself, they dissolve. Also rich and poor things, that dissolves. So that is a great freedom also, and that is one of the attractions which we don't consider, that in these kind of conflicts, when the religious group identities take over, all the inner differences, whether of gender, hierarchy, children, rich, poor, they dissolve for that time being, which is a hugely liberating one. It is like Holi, when all the structures dissolve. And that is, they will all be reimposed again. So that is again one of the attractions.
Yeah, I know, it becomes salient. Religious identity becomes more salient. Yeah. Tushar, are you ready with the questions?
Yes, ma'am. There are several questions, but I think I may give the participants directly the access to raise their question. So, is it okay, or should I read the questions?
But can they come on board and ask, or you can read also?
They are allowed to talk. So let me try once.
Okay.
I'm asking Meghna Datta Roy, is she available? Meghna.
She said hello. Meghna?
Hello. Yes, ma'am, can you hear me?
Yeah, ask your question, Meghna.
Yes, thank you so much for the talk, Professor Kakkar. It was really insightful. My question, can you hear me, Professor Kakkar?
I can hear you well, but I can't see you at all.
One second.
Oh, the video is probably.
I think the video privileges, then the access is not.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Yeah, that's all right. That's all right.
Okay, that's fine.
So it's a question coming from my personal experience as well. So the simpler part of the question is that, is there any form of necessary violence within religion? And why I'm asking this is because, in my personal opinion, I've seen that atheists are often deemed as being angry with God due to a personal conflict, and thus the consequence is a violent withdrawal from one's faith. I've heard this in my family. And so how do we understand this beyond the indoctrinating nature of religion? Yeah, that's all.
That there is necessary violence in all religion?
Is there any form, or is there an imagination of necessary violence within religion?
Yes, for the renewal of of the world, of the renewal of creation. There is that destruction, if one can call it violence, that is absolutely necessary. A Kali Yuga is needed before the Satyug can come. And in that time, there is violence and is seen, it can be deplored, but it is seen as necessary. And it's the same thing in the Buddhist, and it's the same in all kinds of religions. There are visions of great violence, of catastrophic violence before before the renewal, before the new plants and saplings of creation can spring up.
So this is also like fed into when we speak of religious conflict. So this is also a form that is used as a defense when such acts are committed.
Come again with that. What do you mean?
As in, the question, the curiosity is that, is there, when I say necessary, not in the way that it has been indoctrinated, in the way that it is propagated, but when we reflect on religion, can we reflect on that, okay, this form of violence, or that it is something that like that is not only for destruction, that is not only for harming or a division with the other. Like, is there any scope of imagining that sort of a violence where, like, as in, if I take a metaphor from the body body is also constantly, there is violence within the body. There are cells which are dying, and there is autophagy, and there is everything, but there is a requirement of it because something else is being born, something is being healed. So on that line, if I connect religion with the body, so is there any form of necessary violence which is not only for the harm and division?
In fact, Gandhi called the necessary violence non-violence. So he had big discussions with people. What is the limits of non-violence? So, and his was, I think there was one letter. What about a mad dog comes? What do you do with a mad dog comes and bites you? You put down the mad dog. Yes, you do. And the surgeon's violence, is that violence? That surgeon's violence, taking out, cutting out a part of it. That is not violence. So there is what you are saying. That part that will not be considered violence, but that would be a part of the non-violent thing.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Now I would like to invite Rita Mishra. Rita, are you available?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Ask your question.
Yes. Good evening, sir. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Sir, actually, Ashish Nandy says riots in India have lately become very secular because people can hire people and they can go and create a mob and create riot. My question is actually, lately what we are witnessing is lynching. The riots are less and more of lynching and individual attack is there. So the question is like, are there different psychological processes at work? I did go to a clerk's house after the lynching happened, and of course the JNU card and everything was seen very negatively. I am a Hindu Brahmin and middle-aged woman, so I was allowed to go, but I just felt, there was the entire village was very different and agitated, even though only one incident had happened. So I just wanted to get your impressions on this. Thank you, sir.
If you're asking for my impression about the people who are perpetrators, or the one who...
Sir, from riots to, I'm asking, is there a new way of violence happening? The manifestation of violence is changing. No more riots is happening so much, but this lynching is happening quite regularly and across the country.
Which is I think somewhat different, because and that was my question, which I have asked in the which you people or all of us need answers to. That is that communal identities, which used to be only part come when the riots were taking place and were taken off in times of when the riots are not there, when there's time of peace? Have they become armors for some? Are there more and more people who are always in their communal identity? If that is happening, then of course, any person in that armor is looking for to use that armor and the sword and the spear he has for a fight, because that is part of the communal identity armor which he has taken on, which he cannot solve, to look for enemies all the time. So not only that they come in times of riots, but look for wherever the enemy is to, because that is what is going to keep on confirming, I'm right. This is what is needed. It's like you start looking for where is the enemy hiding. So now if that has become, and I think that may be true, that in some parts of the country at least, the communal identity is no longer which takes over people in times of riots, but also when no riots are taking place, more and more people have got that on as their most important part of their identity.
Okay, now I would like to take the third question by Muhammad Arif. Muhammad Arif, can you hear us? Muhammad Arif?
You can ask that question if you have.
Okay, I'll read out the question for you, sir.
Yeah.
So he asked, how do we understand the indoctrination and violence as it becomes very part of religious violence across the world? More importantly, religious communities, mostly orthodox one, use it and justify it.
I'm trying to understand the question.
Should I read it again, sir?
No, I know I've heard the question.
Okay.
I have the habit of trying to first understand it completely before,
Yes.
and still one makes a mistake. One answers questions which one has heard and not what has been put on. What I heard was indoctrination. Can you read the indoctrination part? I mean, what does it say?
How do we understand the indoctrination and violence as it becomes very part of religious violence across the world?
Yeah. The whole point was that we have in us not only we are good people or bad people, but we have in us a dark part of which does not need the indoctrination, but which can come up, and through that indoctrination which happens, it is not ready to be indoctrinated all the time. It is only in times of stress, threat, when other controls are being relaxed, when we start feeling more and more the persecution anxiety, where we are ready for that indoctrination. Otherwise, people do not get indoctrinated that easily. Otherwise, people would have wonderful times of people getting, if people knew how to indoctrinate people. So that is not an easy part to indoctrinate. You can do indoctrination only in times of threat, where people are feeling persecution anxiety and are looking for a solution, or a strong man, or whatever, or what Professor Panda was also calling. Otherwise, the strong man has not much chance of that.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I would then like to invite Paul. Paul, can you hear us?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please ask your question.
Of course, I've posted quite a few of those. So I just want to know Professor Kakkar's view on why does he maintain that religious violence is of greater intensity than other forms of violence, especially because Sir took great pains to explain the historic reasons for the Hindu-Muslim conflict and related violence.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think what I said was that religious violence has, yes, much greater intensity, because it's symbols and metaphors which come from our earliest lives of accompanying elders, parents into religious places, temples, hearing stories. They have a much greater reality, or let's say an impact upon us, than any kind of symbols they related to a profession. My professional identity doesn't have those kinds of symbols which carry so much intensity or weight. They have sunk deeper into my identity than any other comes. So that is certainly one thing. Then the other is that religious violence uh, does not create any guilt. All other kinds of violence would create guilt, but in religious violence, you become, because of precedents, the soldiers. You are not as warriors, service of faith, which has always had, you heard so many stories, etc., from your traditions, how people have sacrificed themselves and have been looked up and celebrated as warriors of faith. So you do not have the guilt of, say, committing murder, killing, as you would have as members of other kinds of groups.
Okay, now last question I would like to take. There are many questions, sir, but I think we should also keep track of time. So last, I would like to invite Anubha. Anubha, can you hear us?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
ask your question.
Good evening, sir. My question is, what could be done to reduce persecution anxiety in both communities?
Okay. I think the persecution anxiety is part of our heritage, but its activation, that is what one wants to reduce. That happens only when there's a feeling of threat of extinction. So the counteracting of those rumors is, I think, one of the most important part. Although at that times it's very difficult to come with reasonable that this is not true. Any community is not going to become extinct. So to reduce the intensity of the threat, to put it in its whatever it's, unless of course the threat is extinction, where then of course it's not persecution anxiety, but very rightly a defense. So that is a different thing. So that is certainly one thing of reducing. And the second thing, I think, which we have not talked of, but which is very important, that this anxiety starts increasing right from the tension to violence as it goes up, and then until the riot dies down. It's very important that in the first 24 hours of very strong police action, with no buts and yes and but, we know from riots from at least from everywhere in the world, that if that is not done in the first 24 hours, because of this increase of the persecution anxiety, it slips out of control of even people, religious, political demagogues, who have tried to steer it in certain directions. It even slips out of their control. So very important part. And that is, of course, always a difficulty in the country and people asking. But the most important part is first the very strong police action, and then the dispelling or the taking down of the rumors which stoke the fire of persecution. Because we also know after the riots, the number of rapes reported is never as much. In fact, very less so. But talking of rapes is how many rapes are happening. They have been raped there and they've been raped there. Increases all that anxiety. But we know that's not the reality at all. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, sir. There are many questions, but we have to keep track of time. Now, at the end of this webinar session, ma'am, you want to say something before I end it with formal vote of thanks? Minati, ma'am. Your audio is mute, ma'am.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Professor Kakkar, when you mentioned about, interventions, what we do, and you talked about offering, trying to work on a superordinate identity, which probably will take precedence over these religious identities, which are founded on, problematic conceptions. You also mentioned about, we need more art, more music, and more cinema. And to be honest, if we look at these, we produce more cinema now. We produce more music now, also more art. But then, what's important is that what kind of cinema we produce, what kind of music we produce. If you look at the TV soap operas, Nagin, Saas Bhi Kabhi Bolte, everywhere, like mother-in-law, daughter-in-law are ready to butcher each other.
Let me clarify.
Yeah.
I said
So
the
those kind of
what I
art,
meant was the resources of art, of music,
Yeah.
art, cinema, which means directed towards this.
Yes.
Not all, you are quite right. Not all cinema art, etc. But the resources of art, in the sense that that much of what I'm talking about is not available to conscious language.
Yeah.
Language doesn't reach all parts of it. So art does, and you are
art
quite
does.
right. Art does, and we do not use art enough. But
We
art,
do
you
not.
are quite right. Not you were talking about Nagin and all. No.
Yeah.
Producing
And
producing cinema, producing music, producing others.
yeah.
Which is very much
The aesthetic.
directed
Yeah.
towards. Yeah. That's what I meant. Sorry.
That I understood. I thought it should be made little explicit. In the sense, I'm reminded of this culture industry, which talks about mass culture, and when the place of aesthetics in the people's and communities' life. So we need good art, we need good cinema, and we probably need to now talk against certain kinds of TV shows, certain kinds of cinemas or operas. So we need more art, but we need to also, I think the society has to also engage in, the kind of aesthetics, the kind of art we need to engage in. And they work mysteriously on our psyche, and actually positively, but yet mysteriously on our psyche.
Because
it
in
was
language,
wonderful.
As you said, your husband is also poetry.
Yeah, he
In
writes.
language, poetry is the nearest to the aesthetic which I'm asking of. Poem, you remember small verses, etc., much more than any of the longer essays, etc., which is, so to use the poetry too, but directed.
It also not only cathartic, I think it also provides tools to deal with the dark, the unknown, anxiety producing unconscious.
Absolutely,
and so I remember my my father-in-law's elder brother. Long back, that was in mid-90s, he wrote a small piece. What happens to a society that stops reading poetry? And he almost preempted a lot of what we were talking about, because I grew up with a lot of poetry. And I remember even when I joined JNU as a student, I started with Khalil Gibran. I learned Bengali to read, Tagore. I thought you can read the original works. So, but we were sort of driven to read poetry. Now nobody talks about that. Not many talk about that. Reading poetry was part of Odia culture, earlier. Now people write. I don't say that they don't. So bringing good art to life is very, very important. And there I agree with you completely. And thank you. Thank you for a very, very brilliant talk.
Thank you very much.
And we will continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
We'll continue with this theme, and we'll get more speakers on board, but we'll also try to get you again in a dialogical mode. So we can have 1 or 2 or 3 people and then dialogue. That will be a slightly different kind of exercise. And thank you. Thanks a lot.
And thank you, Tushar. Thank you very much for taking care of this.
Thank you, sir. It's my pride, privilege to offer thanks to a person of immense honored like you, sir. I am very thankful to you on my personal behalf as well as on the behalf of NAOP for accepting our invitation and given your precious time. I am sure that the attendees who have been benefited by your talk. I would like to mention here that we had more than 300 registrations for this webinar, 100 participants who joined here.
Mhm.
Other than that, there were many. I was following regularly on our Facebook page. There were more than 100 participants listening to your lecture there on Facebook live streaming. There were more than 2 dozens of questions. Due to the scarcity of time, we could ask only 8 or 9 questions. But I am sure that they will get more opportunities to ask and interact about these questions in our future webinars. I would also like to thank Minati ma'am for organizing this wonderful webinar. It was one of its kind, and I'm sure that the further series on this topic will also be enriching. I would also like to thank all the attendees here as well as on our Facebook live page for giving their precious time for listening to Professor Kakkar, enhancing their understanding in this subject, and always being supported to NAOP community. I would also like to thank NAOP officers, our President Narayanan Srinivasan sir, Secretary Sonali ma'am, and all other officers at NAOP who have given me, entrusted me with this responsibility to organize NAOP webinar. I thank you all, and with this, I seek your permission to end this meeting with happy note. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Tushar.
Thank you. Thank you very much also.
Thanks again, sir and ma'am, and now I will end this meeting. Thank you all.